Good morning and good afternoon. This is Monica Paolini from Senza Fili, and today I have the pleasure to talk to Martin Harriman. He is the chairman and CEO at Cambridge Communication Systems, CCS, and we're going to talk today about uh, fixed wireless access and backhaul in millimeter wave spectrum, mostly focusing on the 60 gigahertz band. This is really quite interesting because 60 gigahertz is not, we've been talking for a long time. But I think that now what we are in a situation where the band is becoming particularly interesting for a lot of different applications. And Martin will talk about us why 60 gigahertz, why now, what can we do with it? And Martin, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Monica. Good to be here.
Okay, so let's just get started and let the people know about CCS. What do you guys do?
So CCS has been around for quite a long time. It's a Cambridge based business in the UK, and was formed by a bunch of guys who had a lot of experience in the microwave industry, um, and had a bunch of ideas about some of the things that had held back microwave from becoming a sort of mainstream product within the service provider market in particular, but also within enterprise, and formed CCS almost 10 years ago to try and address some of those issues from the outset. So they identify things that they believe to be impediments to the more widespread use of microwave, whether it's point to point, point to multi-point, multi-point to multi-point, and they engineered that into the early products that they built, and they did a great job. They started in the 28 gigahertz band, which is, as you know, licensed band, and they built out a ton of capability in that band. And now we've developed a bunch of products into the 60 gigahertz band, and we'll maybe talk about why we made that decision as we discuss it. But the business is still based in Cambridge. Most of our engineers are there, and we're a proud Cambridge company.
Yeah, and actually, I have to say, I used to live a few blocks away from where you are. And so when I saw a demo, I thought looks so incredibly familiar. And it was, because it was, like looking at all the neighborhood I would just walk through every day. So that was kind of interesting. And, as you say, this is a technology that, works for different bands. So to some extent, all the advantages are not specific to a band, but at the same time, the specific properties of a band change to some extent the value proposition or what you want to do specifically in that band. And maybe you can tell a little bit about again, why 60 gigahertz? What is that you can do there that you can do there better than in other bands?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. So I think before saying why 60 gigahertz, it's probably important to say why not 28 gigahertz. Listen, the 28 gigahertz has a bunch of properties that make it a very attractive band to use for microwave. It's got good propagation characteristics. It's a good band for microwave, but the issue is it's a licensed band. And it isn't the only thing you can use the 28 gigahertz band for. So we found lots of interest in that band, and we've done lots of trials. We've done lots of field trial deployments, and there are still a lot of interest in that area. But it was just another thing that stacked up against using microwave. Now, microwave gets a bad rep. It really does, because it has to seem to be cheaper than a fixed connection. It has to be seen to be more resilient than a fixed connection. So it starts with a bunch of impediments, and the industry as a whole has maybe not done the best job over the years in knocking back those impediments, those views that make people think it's not the right technology to be using in networks. having to also use valuable licensed spectrum was just another thing I think which has held back operators from using it. The 60 gigahertz band has a bunch of advantages, which is why people are so interested in it. You know, first of all, it's unlicensed, so there are no spectrum licenses associated with it. I can tell you from having been on the board of a large mobile operator that, you know, that instantly gets people's interest up when overall margins within those businesses are not what they used to be. Secondly, you can deploy really large channel widths in 60 gigahertz, so you can carry a heavy payload in 60 gigahertz. And if you look at the applications where it will be deployed, and I think there are two areas where it seems to me fairly obvious that the 60 gigahertz band is going to have utility. That's in terms of mobile backhaul and in terms of fixed wireless, whether that's to an enterprise customer or a consumer home. The natural impediment to using 60 gigahertz, which is range because of its propagation characteristics, actually is not such an issue. Because if I look at the problem I'm solving in a backhaul scenario for 5G, for example, the problem I'm solving is the fact that I've got small antennas all over the place because I'm using microwave or the higher bands to deploy that 5G. And therefore, I hit the same issues. I need lots of them. And it's not so much a propagation issue for me with 5G, it's the payload, because I'm deploying a technology which can carry a lot of traffic. And therefore, the issue that 5G has is that how do you get fiber to all of those points? The answer is it's really difficult, particularly in urban environments, because it's just not that easy. So 60 gigahertz, the fact that it's short range, the propagation is not so great, really is not an issue to that. In terms of the home, you know, the ability to deploy relatively small pieces of equipment. If you look at the size of a 60 gigahertz CPE, it's the size of a paperback book. I know people can't remember what they used to look like, but we remember what a paperback book looks like. It's about the size of a paperback book and doesn't really weigh much more. So 60 gigahertz has a lot of characteristics that make it a really attractive frequency band to deploy radio technologies.
Absolutely, and in, you know, not paradoxically, but I guess it's a good thing, is that the what has been traditionally the reason why you couldn't use the 60 gigahertz band much is actually an advantage, because
Yes, it
the
is.
limited the limited reach means better frequency reuse. More frequency reuse means more capacity and more flexibility, because
Absolutely.
you kind of you trade off with the interference. Okay, so the dimension is an advantage, the cost is an advantage, but I would say that the important thing, that the contribution here is that in order to hold everything together and go get all these advantages together, is the fact that you can use a mesh, you can use beamforming, you can use multipath. So there is a lot of other things that have come along to make this sort of traditionally disadvantages to become the strength of the band. On top of the fact, obviously, that it's unlicensed, so everybody can use it.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I think that whilst we've been having this debate about bands, and whilst microwave's been having its perennial debate about whether it's, you know, the right technology to be using in the access layer of a network or the transport layer of a network, the technology in the background has been continuing to develop. And so if you look at, and it's not just the technology in terms of its capability, it's also technology in terms of its cost. I mean, you know, phased array antennas, beamforming capability 5 years ago would have meant that this equipment wouldn't have got within a country mile of the price points that it would be required to do that. Now, that technology, like all technologies in networks, has continued to reduce in cost, has continued to miniaturize, and now is actually accessible at a price point, which means that the subcomponent level of these products are now at a price point, which means you can deploy this, whether it's into the network itself or whether it's right at the edge of the network, where, you know, CPE, kind of everybody knows roughly what that kind of cost point is, because we have a very good comparator in terms of what the fixed network costs are. And you know, where we are as an industry now, not just CCS, but overall as an industry, is we know that we can get to those cost points, and that's been a big impediment and a blockage, and we're kind of through that blockage now.
Yeah, absolutely. Now let's talk about the uses, but before we do that, there is another thing that so 60 gigahertz also had a reputation, always had a reputation like you can reach anything, you know, that kind of problem. But when you talk about mesh,
Hmm.
there's also a word that a lot of people see sort of as a bad word, like why you don't use mesh. With mesh is difficult to manage. A mesh adds a lot of latency. If you do not have enough density, it just doesn't work. So how do you get mesh to work to, for this kind of deployments?
Well, first of all, I agree with those previous concerns, by the way, which is meshes were difficult to deploy because it was a difficult network planning job to do it. And whilst it was clearly an optimal use of microwave, the kind of practical and logistical and planning issues meant that it was not really something that could be done. Now, mesh technologies have improved. CCS have been at the forefront of that. And so what CCS brings to the party is a self-organizing mesh. And that's a critical enabler in this technology. So what do I mean by self-organizing? What I mean is that the nodes in the mesh are self-aware. They know where they are. They know where they are relative to other nodes in that mesh. And they're able to plan routes across that mesh automatically. So when I deploy it, instead of having to deploy this mesh and using very complex planning tools that, by the way, then get completely ruined because installers don't do a really good job of installing radio equipment in accordance with the plan. I don't need to do that anymore. I don't actually need a network guy at all. What I actually need is an electrician, because this equipment just needs power. Once the equipment's deployed, it's the software layer that deals with the network planning. And that overcomes a major impediment of a mesh, which was planning and implementation. But it then creates two new opportunities for it. First of all, it's dynamic. So you are capable of planning routes across the mesh, which are based on whatever you want to optimize. If you want to optimize against latency, well, then it will automatically find the shortest route. But if you look at the latency between nodes and then multiply that up, even in really quite a large mesh, you can still get across that mesh in a very comparable latency to a fixed connection. So you've got that dynamic capability. The second thing is, a lot of people have been concerned about interference, multipath in particular, because if you're deploying either as an access technology or a backhaul technology into an urban environment, you will have lots of multipath. That's just the way it works, as we all know. Particularly as we have an obsession with building buildings which look to microwave like mirrors, and one of the advantages of the CCS mesh is that not only can it work with multipath in terms of, how does it cope with multipath, it actually turns it completely the other way around and says that actually multipath is something I can use. So if it can see a multipath through the network and it sees that as the most effective way of getting from A to B, it will use the multipath path. And that's completely different. Now, I'm not saying that's how you want to build your network. You don't want to start building a network that's using multipath as its main ways of doing it, because obviously, weather conditions change, topologies change, buildings go up and down, buses go past, all sorts of things happen. But what it means is that the network is able to not only deal with interference, in some instances, it's actually able to use interference as a positive way of enhancing the mesh network.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about different use cases. So you talked about backhaul, cellular backhaul, and fixed wireless access to home and businesses.
Yeah.
Which one do you want to talk about it first?
Let's talk about backhaul first,
Mhm.
because so the backhaul use case for 60 gigahertz is pretty compelling, because if you look at what's going on with 5G and look at how I think operators will deploy 5G, it's pretty clear. We can see with what Verizon are doing, we can see what AT&T are doing, and we can see it on the early deployments in Europe, is they're going to use their valuable lower band spectrum to provide 5G coverage, which allows them to, tell everyone they've got a 5G network and provide some of the advantages of 5G. But what they're going to do in urban environments, whether it's in transportation hubs, whether it's in arenas, whether it's in the centers of cities, they're going to deploy a lot of microwave or the higher band 5G, because it's perfect for it. It's been auctioned in a number of jurisdictions now, and that's great. It's a fantastic use case of that spectrum. 5G is almost tailor made to use it, but it immediately brings with it the issue of backhaul. We have these little cell sites which might be the size of a small roll-along suitcase, which are needing to backhaul the amount of traffic that the biggest macro base station in my network used to do. And that was fine because I just fibered up all my big macro base stations. My ability to fiber up these small cells, I hesitate to use that because small cells itself has got a whole bunch of baggage around it, but they are smaller cells. They're going to be high band, urban and dense urban deployments of cells. It's just not going to be possible to get fiber to all of them. They are going to need to have some sort of gigabit capable backhaul. And that's where I think 60 gig has got a real opportunity to be not the dominant technology, because if I can get to fiber, I'm going to do that because I've kind of future-proofed myself. But if I can't get to fiber, and it's not economical for me to bring fiber to that point, 60 gigahertz radio has a real utility in that space. And actually the mesh has a real, the mesh then becomes a really superior point of difference in terms of being able to do multi-point to multi-point.
Yeah.
The issue is not much of that's been deployed so far. And if you look at what happened with 4G, operators talked. I was in an operator at the time of 4G, the early 4G deployments. We kind of thought we'd end up in a 4G network which had a lot of small cells deployed. In reality, not a lot has happened. Some operators deployed some small cells, but in reality, they have not quite gone there. And there are a whole bunch of reasons we can speculate why that's not happened, but it just doesn't work in 5G.
Absolutely.
You simply will not be able to sweat the asset being the spectrum that you've bought, if you don't deploy it in the higher bands in an urban environment where you're needing to put lots of capacity.
No, absolutely. And as you go to higher frequencies, then the macro really do not work. You need to have smaller cells.
Totally.
So, and I think that, as you said, for small cells the adoption has been slow. It's much slower than we expected. But eventually we know we need to get there. And I would say that, one of the reasons is the inability to get a reliable backhaul. Because
Yeah.
what's the point of having a small cell if the bottleneck is the backhaul, which and this is clearly a way to address it. But let's go back to fiber, because arguably wherever you have a sufficiently high density of people, like most metropolitan areas where let's say the places where you put small cells, typically you do have fiber around it. So what do you need wireless?
Yeah, but you do have fiber, but you don't have. I mean, when you say you have fiber, you do have fiber,
Mm.
but if you take the scenario of a dense urban environment, a probably more applicable to a European sort of city layout than a US city layout, where Europe still has very active metropolitan centers of its cities, whether it's London, whether it's, Berlin, whether it's Paris. Actually, there is a lot of fiber in those cities, but there's not as much as you would think. And actually getting a fiber connection, so for example, there could be fiber to a building, and great if I can access that fiber. That's where I'm going to put my, small cells. I'll do a deal with the landlord. I'll figure out a commercial way of getting myself fiber to those. But what about a street where I'm looking to put small cells onto lampposts? So what about where I'm planning to put them onto advertising hoardings? Or there are lots of places that I am going to start thinking about putting 5G capability where fiber may not be as easy as you think to get access to. Now, fiber's never going to be far away. So this isn't saying, I'm going to take Oxford Circus in London or the center of Munich and say that it's all going to be radio. So I've got no fiber. Clearly, there's a ton of fiber in those cities, but it won't always be available where I want to deploy my network. And so I think what you'll see is you'll see radio being used to simplify that problem. So it'll be used as an easy way of getting back that backhaul traffic to the nearest fiber point. And it lends itself really well to that.
Yeah. Well, and also, even if you do have fiber, it doesn't mean, first of all, as you say, it might not be the best way to get to the lamppost, and it might be too expensive. And also, it doesn't necessarily mean that whatever the entity is that wants to put the small cell is the entity that has cheap access to fiber.
Absolutely.
So the fact that there is fiber there doesn't necessarily mean that that's the best way or a way to access it. Now, okay, so and so this is really, this is crucial because you need to have the right backhaul for 5G especially. Now, what about the fixed access? So for both businesses and homes.
Yeah, so fixed wireless access and 60 gigahertz is suddenly becoming something that a lot of people are talking about, and I can see why, really, because if you look at previous iterations of fixed wireless access technologies, they have not been comparable typically in terms of cost with fiber or in terms of throughput. Well, 60 gigahertz, that's not the case at all. And if you want a gigabit connection to the home, it's entirely possible to do that with 60 gigahertz fixed wireless radio. So I think where we see that opportunity is where people are. Well, let me start by talking about the demand. It is really clear in developed markets that gigabit broadband is something that people are becoming extremely familiar with. People are, mainly through the huge surge in use of streaming video. Because, to be clear, what's driving this traffic? It's video, and it's video. We all know. I have a device that has the screen the size, I have a screen this size, and yet it's pulling down a 4K, image, which is ridiculous. I can't possibly see that, but my device is demanding it of the network, and if it's available, it will take it. So gigabit connectivity is becoming something that people are very aware of. They see now that they need significantly higher speeds and capacity than they typically had in the past. So what's that doing? It's driving fiber to the home in developed nations. So you see some countries have taken more of a sort of industrial political view of how to deploy fiber. The market dynamics have been more favorable to using fiber than in others. But what you see is you see a surge in fiber deployments in both the US and in Europe. So in Spain, you have 60% plus penetration of fiber to the home. In UK and Germany, you see a really competitive environment now for alternative operators to drive out fiber deployments. So what does that tell me? It tells me the customer need is there. It tells me the customer need is there. What does that mean? And why has radio got a place to play in this? Well, it's a simple one, really. It's because we're about to be interrupted, so we'll pause there because I can hear a small
Yeah.
child. He's gone.
Okay.
I'll start again.
Okay. Start again. Perfect.
So why has microwave fixed wireless access got a role to play in this kind of gigabit fiber world? Simple, really, which is it is not economic today to take fiber to every property. And that can be a variety of reasons. It could be population density. So as you know, particularly suburban environments where you've got less dense housing, the business case is harder to justify because I'm deploying all of this infrastructure simply to get to the suburb, and then when I get there, I really haven't actually got that many people to buy my service. Or it can be rural environments where I've got a very long hop to get there, which costs me a lot of money to provision. And again, I haven't got that many homes at the end. So in those scenarios, what we see happening is people looking at radio as a technology that they can deploy quickly. I've heard it called a number of times, and I like the term virtual fiber because I think as a consumer, I could understand that. It offers me the same thing. I mean, as a consumer, I'm not interested if it comes from a satellite, from a wireless node, or from fiber. I just know that I want really fast internet in my house. And then the other thing is that the advantage that it has in this mix is it can be deployed really quickly. And if you look at what is holding back fiber deployment, it was for a long time capital. People were not deploying enough capital to build these fiber access networks. That's no longer the case. There are plenty of infrastructure funds in the US and Europe who are looking to deploy capital into fiber networks. The issue now is just the cold, hard logistics of doing it. It's getting the permits and way leaves. It's getting the construction teams in place. It's getting the services. It's all doable, but it takes a long time to do. And I aside from being part of the CCS family, I also chair one of the UK alternate fiber operators. And I can tell you that, when people are talking about fiber deployments, all of the problems are around deployment. The advantage of radio is I can deploy super quick. I don't need, in most instances, any kind of permit or way leave. I need a bunch of electricians. I can even get to a point where people can self-install the CPE in their own home. And that has advantages because if I want to light up a region of my network, I can do it super quick. And there's no reason then, when I've proved that I've got the customer demand I need, that I cannot then come in with fiber and take that radio equipment and move elsewhere. So I think radio's got a really strong role to play in fixed wireless access.
Yeah, and I think I really like your concept about virtual fiber because it's really first of all you don't care what it is as long as you have the service, but it's also traditionally the view was, is it fiber, is it wireline or wireline, or is it wireless, as if the two are sort of mutually exclusive, but they really aren't. And I think that the fact that, for instance, we're working with Adtran, which is a fixed provider. I think that that's sort of and maybe you can talk about that. It sort of exemplifies the fact that it's no longer one or the other. It's a question of how the different technologies can be brought together to provide a service, which got to be backhaul or access in a more efficient way.
So I think, I mean, I 100% agree with you because ultimately, listen, this is about the service. We like to talk about infrastructure, we like to talk about technologies, but actually we deliver a service. Our consumers know what that service is now. It's streaming video, whether that's streaming video through social media, whether it's streaming video direct from an aggregator like Netflix, or whether it's streaming video that content I've created myself. We know that what the service is that we are delivering is video. And what we need what we need to be able to do for the operators that are our customers is give them the easiest, most cost-effective way of providing that service. They're service providers, and 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 the technology, it kind of doesn't need to be invisible, because at heart they're still technology businesses. But what we need to do is put the technology into the background, bring the service into the foreground. And the reason we are so pleased to be working with Adtran is that when we're talking to operators who are looking to deploy high-speed broadband into the edge of their networks, we're able to bring either wireless or fiber, and Adtran has a fabulous fiber portfolio, or both, and managed by the same management system. So that from a network operation perspective, it's effectively seamless. And that is a critical capability. Now, how much wireless gets deployed, how much fiber gets deployed, doesn't actually matter. What matters is that the network is built in the most cost-efficient way for the operator. Do you know it's probably going to be 80, 90% fiber, 10, 20% radio, I suspect. But by bringing them both together and by managing them under the same network management platform, it means that operators, it becomes impervious. It allows them the ability to create this hybrid fiber network with sort of virtual fiber capability of radio plus the fiber plant that they've already got.
Absolutely. And they can also go into areas where fiber is just not available. And there are places like that even in our metropolitan cities, even New York, even in London, there are areas where you do not have fiber. But what about also, and let me sort of a final question here, how does it relate to like sort of its developed markets all the way to rural and then emerging markets? How do you see the impact of 60 gigahertz in wireless there?
So I think we've talked quite a bit about what I would call the developed market use case for 60 gigahertz, and I think it's fairly obvious. I think the opportunity that's created with this technology for developing markets is really significant. And clearly we see Facebook through Terragraph beginning to address that, and the sort of internet for all capability. It clearly has it, because if I don't have fixed infrastructure today, this is going to be a very significantly cheaper option to build that broadband network than starting from scratch by trying to build physical infrastructure in the ground. So I think there is tremendous utility for 60 gigahertz in developing markets. And we've spent a lot of time talking to a lot of companies that are looking into the developing markets. I think at the moment, our focus is very much on, what we can see in front of us now. What we can see in front of us now is a huge appetite building for using this technology, first of all, for fixed wireless, because that market's here and now, but then quickly into the 5G opportunities that the backhaul problems create. But I think then there's a real opportunity in developing markets, and it's something where I see 60 gigahertz having real utility.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, and that's because, traditionally with our, you just need a basic connection, but people everywhere in the world, everybody loves video. So, so that demand for high capacity connection to the home or small businesses, it's everywhere.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Martin, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today. It was great, and it's we were talking about a market that it's really quite exciting to see how you can use a technology. It's sort of the synergy of technology to develop to deliver a service that it's highly innovative, but at the same time, we know the demand is there.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for listening to this interviews with Martin Harriman at CCS.